So it's part 2 of the lecture on descriptive research. Surveys and panels are similar ways to collect descriptions. Usually when one uses the term survey, one means a cross-sectional survey, which is collecting data from a large group of people at one point in time. And typically when one talks about panels, one is talking about collecting data from a specific set of people at several points in time. So the characteristics of cross-sectional and longitudinal capture that difference in time. There's also the difference in the sample. So cross-sectional is a large sample that usually is designed to represent a population well, whereas in a panel you have a specific set of individuals who have agreed to participate in this data collection on an ongoing basis, and they often are not a good representation of a large sample, in large part simply because they've agreed to participate in this data collection activity on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, which makes them kind of unusual people. There is an intermediate phase, a time series cross-sectional survey approach, in which a survey could be administered at one point in time, and then a month later or a year later or some period of time later, the same survey would be administered, and that survey could be administered as many times as the researcher wanted to administer it. That's different from a panel, again, in that surveys are administered to a large group that's recruited somehow, and each application of the survey would be a different group of people, whereas the panel is responded each time the panel collects data, it's from the same group of people. Now, the advantage of the survey approach is that you are able to do a better job of getting a representative group. The advantage of the panel data, the principal advantage, is that you reduce respondent errors because you've got people who are filling out similar kinds of survey instruments every week or every month, and they obviously get good at it. And you don't have as much of a reliability problem because you've got the same group of people each time. If you were to try to do a set of longitudinal surveys, you'd have different people in each administration, and they would add error to the measurement. Panels now usually are mail or diary panels. So mail panel would be a group of people who receive a survey form in the mail every week or every month, whatever the time period is. A diary panel means that people are trying to keep track of their behaviors on a daily basis, usually, although you can have weekly diaries. But rather than have a survey, they're simply keeping track of what products they bought or where they saw commercials or what brands they chose, whatever the measures are. We're seeing an increase now in internet-based panels, in particular with the ability of the internet to identify people who have a strong interest in a narrow area. So you can have motorcycle fans who are internet connected and happy to talk about motorcycles, and so they are a natural target for a panel, maybe by Honda or Harley Davidson. People who are very interested in, I don't know, doing fancy things with fingernail polish it's easy to identify those people from blogs or from special interest groups on the internet, and often because they're interested, they're willing to participate in a panel that can be useful. There are a number of long-time firms that provide panels and sell panel data on a subscription basis. National Family Opinion may be the most famous. Market Facts Consumer Mail Panel is another one, and Home Testing Institute is another one. So if you want to, you negotiate a deal with these people, and you can get information on your product category that they're already collecting. You can propose additional questions to be added to some subset of their panel, or some combination of that. So what are the characteristics of panels as a type of or a survey instrument, a way to collect descriptive data? Well, in terms of complexity and flexibility, they have the same kinds of problems as mail surveys or internet surveys, but because these are people that are veterans, because they are responding to similar kinds of instruments regularly, they're better than mail surveys. The quantity of data is very good, again, because these people are being paid or have volunteered to participate in the panel, and so they know that they're expected to be responsive. They know that they're going to be available for follow-up. Often a panel will collect information about a new product idea or a new product, a batch version of a new product, and so they receive this product and they know that they're going to be asked later, and so their responses are very good. Sample control is very good. You can identify, because it's an ongoing panel, the researcher typically will invest more time in identifying the people that he wants to be in the panel, and that's good. On the other hand, there is a self-selection bias. It's a different kind of person who agrees to give responses every week over the course of a year than it is even willingness to respond to one survey. And so one always has to be aware that these are volunteers, and that volunteers are apt to be different from normal consumers. There's also the problem with a panel where the makeup of the panel changes over time. Because a panel is supposed to be the same people, there is the presumption from the researcher that any change that occurs is not due to different peoples having been measured. But in fact, panels do change. They tend to change slowly, but those changes should be monitored. The quality of the data is, again, very good because people are good responders to surveys. Response rate is very good. It's not 100%, but it's certainly well above what one would expect from a mail survey. The speed, again, low. It is mail. Typically, it is sort of in the matter of days, but less than a matter of weeks, which would be typical in a mail survey. Costs are good. It is expensive. These people are often being paid considerably more than they would be paid if they were participating in a one-time survey. But because the panel may be run by a third party, those costs are apt to be shared across a number of clients. Has many uses. As I mentioned, it's a very nice way to get information on a product follow-up. It's a very good way to measure responses to low-frequency purchase products. So if you want to get responses to canned soup purchase, a survey is fine because people buy canned soup uh, regularly. But if you wanted to buy, or if you wanted to get responses to an automobile purchase, then a panel may be a better way because there'll be some people in the panel who are buying, but um, not everybody. So it gives you a chance to get some people who are in the purchase uh, time frame. That's what I want to say. Um, the biggest advantage of, or the biggest use is the chief advantage of panels, and that is to monitor reaction to changes. So if you change your advertising, if you change your product packaging, if you change your product design or your pricing or your distribution, um, it's incumbent upon the researcher to have some measure beforehand and after. And because panels are run on this ongoing basis, no matter what you do, you've got some measures beforehand and you can get some measures after. If you're relying on survey research, you have to have known ahead of time to do a survey. And often when you did a survey previous to the change, it was too far back, or it was the questions were not appropriate to the change that you're making, and so you don't know exactly where people were before you made the change. I'd like to talk about errors in descriptive research. First, survey sample errors. So these are errors that result because of the way the sample was constructed. There are two types of survey sample errors, random and systematic. Random errors are uncontrollable errors. It's like flipping a coin. A fair coin, we know in the long run, will be turn up heads 50% of the time, tails 50% of the time. If you flip it only 10 times, you know that there's a chance that you'll get 8 heads or 9 heads or even 10 heads. There's no guarantee that you'll get 5 heads and 5 tails because the outcome is essentially random. You can't control the way the coin is being flipped. In survey research, random errors are inappropriate or non-representative distributions of individual differences. So that term, individual differences, is an important concept. Individual differences are ways that members of the sample can be different. Different ages, different sexes, all the demographic characteristics, all the psychographic characteristics that I talked about earlier in terms of respondent characteristics. And those individual differences affect the overall representativeness of the sample. Normally, the researcher is hoping that the sample that's constructed represents the population at large, or is similar to the population at large, which means that these individual characteristics fall in the same proportion in the sample that they fall in the population at large. So if one were sampling students at Seattle University and one knows that 54% of the students at Seattle University are female and 46% are male, one would hope that the sample ended up being 54% female and 46% male. But by chance, a sample of 100 people may have 60 women and 40 men, or even 30 women and 70 men. So that individual difference would affect the representativeness of the sample as a whole. A lot of survey research is done to describe groups. So within the sample as a whole, there may be categories. So one may want to compare men and women, for example. And a random error would result in different levels of an individual characteristic within men and women. So if one were looking at awareness of a new brand, and let's say that 10% of the population has tried or is aware of this new brand, it may be that by chance 20% of the women in the sample were aware and only 8% of the men were aware. So it would make a comparison of men and women non-representative relative to the population as a whole, because those chance differences in individual characteristics. Now, as I say, random errors are uncontrollable, but it is the stuff of statistics to deal with random errors. All of statistics are designed to help us be more confident about the effect of random errors. So one way to deal with random errors is simply to collect more information, to have bigger sample sizes. That's not true of systematic sample errors. There are two types of systematic sample errors. One is the identification and selection of the sample. So having a technique for including people in the sample, if that technique is wrong, then you'll get a non-representative sample. The easiest way to get a non-representative sample is have a bad sampling frame. Now, sampling frame is the list of all the members of the population. So if I wanted to sample all the people in the Puget Sound area, a sampling frame would be a list of all those people's names. I don't know where I would get such a list. So often the sampling frame we are forced to use is some approximation of the ideal sampling frame. Now, if one were to say random dial telephone numbers in the 206 area code, that would lead to a non-representative sample because there are lots of people in the Puget Sound area who don't have telephones with the 206 area code, because the Puget Sound area, by any reasonable definition, would include other prefixes, 425, and many people who live in the area have mobile phones with other prefixes. The method of selection, it may not be the sample frame that's the problem, but simply the method by which people are selected. So stopping people on the streets of downtown Seattle clearly is not going to give you a representative sample of people in the Puget Sound area, because many people in the Puget Sound area never go downtown Seattle and certainly wouldn't have been downtown Seattle on a given day or a given time. The other systematic sample error is due to non-response or self-selection. I've mentioned this several times already. The fact that people volunteered to participate may make them different from people who don't volunteer, or people who complete a survey, stick it out to the end, may be different from people who stop or who refuse to answer particular questions. Certain kinds of people are not at home. Certain kinds of people are too busy to stop and participate. Certain kinds of people have personality traits that make them less likely to be agreeable. So you've got random errors and systematic errors. How do you mitigate those? Well, as I said, you mitigate against random error problems by having large sample sizes. You mitigate against sample identification problems by having some sense of the percentages in the population. Now, here's kind of a catch-22, because often you're doing a survey to come up with good estimates of percentages in the population. And so I'm telling you to use some sense of what those percentages are to check your sample. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing there. But what I mean is that there are some characteristics that you know, or you have a pretty good idea for the population. You're not likely to do a survey, for example, to determine the proportion of men and women at Seattle University. If you were surveying students at Seattle University, it's probably to measure something else, their product use or their beliefs about a given topic. But you do know the percentage of men and women, and that can be used to check your sample. So you may have several measures of the population that you think you know pretty comfortably, and you can check your sample on each of those several dimensions to see if your sample appears to be representative of the population. Now, if you do have about the right percentage of females, and you do have about the right percentage of international students, and you do have about the right percentage of people in each of the majors, and you know that information about the university, then you begin to feel more comfortable that you have about the right percentage of people who have had experience with a given product, or who have a particular political affiliation, or whatever the dimensions are that you're concerned about. And finally, call back. Call back, call back, call back. This assures that you get the people that you were intending to get, and that you get people, at least a fair proportion of the people who were unwilling to participate originally. Now, non-sampling response errors. So these are errors that result in invalid responses that are more a function of the response to the questions and are not a function of who gets in the sample and who doesn't. Two categories of non-sampling response errors: systematic and random. Again, just as with sampling, you've got systematic errors and random errors. Take the systematic errors first. So these are errors that systematically inflate or decrease the value of the information that you collected. So if you think about a scale, let's say a scale from 1 to 10, systematic error is going to give you a higher number or a lower number than the true number. So one type of systematic error is called demand. Demand means that there's something in the nature of the measurement that is encouraging people to respond in a certain way, to exaggerate or to underestimate the true answer. Demand can be deliberate or unconscious. That is, the question may be worded in such a way as to encourage people to inflate or underestimate their answer. You see this in political surveys all the time. You're asking people their support for the current administration, and you word the question in such a way that you get a much more positive answer than would be true if you ask it in a more objective way. Or it can be unconscious, where often researchers are human, and researchers often have expectations or desires about the way the research will come out. And even if those researchers are careful to try to be objective, their unconscious desires may be reflected. Now, what does demand mean? Well, demand usually gets translated into what psychologists or experimentalists call good subject responses. A good subject is somebody who wants to confirm the hypothesis. So in marketing research, often the research is sponsored by a given brand or a given company, and even if the researcher tries to keep that anonymous, it may be obvious if most of your questions are about Honda Civics, for example, the subject may think that this is a survey about Honda Civics, and a good subject would be someone who tries to make Honda Civic look good in answering those questions. And so that's would be an upward bias. There are also bad subjects who try to be negative, try to disprove the hypothesis as well. So, but demand is sort of a general characteristic of research in which there's some suggestion about how the question should be answered. Acquiescence is a bias that's sometimes called yay saying. It's a tendency to agree or to say yes or to be positive on all the questions. The opposite is less frequent, but it is also called an acquiescence bias. So people who tend to disagree or to be negative on all the questions would be exhibiting an acquiescence bias. Extremity bias is a tendency to use the very low and the very high values on a scale. So if a person is slightly above neutral, he may respond with a 7 on a 7-point scale or a 6 on a 7-point scale. And if a person is slightly below neutral, he might respond with a 1 or a 2. So it's just using the outsides of the scales. Social desirability, I think, for marketing may be the most common kind of systematic bias. This is a tendency to answer in ways that make one look good in the eyes of the researcher. But it may even be to make one look good in one's own eyes. So questions that may reflect intelligence or reasonableness or attractiveness or success are often going to be answered in ways that exaggerate one's true reasonableness or attractiveness or intelligence or success, simply because of a social desirability. One, as an interviewee, I want to make myself look more socially desirable. And then there are interviewer-coder factors that systematically lead to error. The experimenter effect, you have a reading on the experimenter effect. This is a sort of unconscious creation of demand on the part of the interviewer or the experimenter that leads people to answers. There is bias on the part of the person collecting the information. There may be racial bias or sexual bias or ethnicity bias, where an interviewer, for example, simply treats some other people differently, more positively, more negatively than others. And there's fraud. Researchers that are being paid by the survey may commit fraud. They may complete surveys that are incomplete. They may fill out entire surveys that were never administered to anybody in order to be paid. Less likely, but certainly possible, is interviewers could change answers to questions in order to make the research come out in a certain way. So those are all systematic non-sampling response errors that occur in response to the survey itself. There are also random factors that affect the way people respond to questions. The situation or the mood. Mood is by definition a temporary condition, and there's good evidence to indicate that when people are in a good mood, they tend to be generally more positive and more approving in the way they answer questions, and when they're in a bad mood, they tend to be less so. And all of those individual differences that affect the makeup of the sample will also affect the way they respond to individual questions. So obviously, intelligence and knowledge will affect the way people answer belief questions. And whether people are intelligent or knowledgeable is random. So we don't know from one person to the next. So how do we mitigate respondent errors? Well, pretest, pretest, pretest. To assure that people understand the questions properly, to assure that people don't feel pressure to answer in a certain way, to discover whether people are guessing what the hypothesis is, to assure that interviewers are not displaying any sort of bias, to find out whether people are responding with an acquiescence bias or an extremity bias. We do pretests. And in those pretests, often unlike in the ultimate survey, there may be some interactivity. So you may administer the pretest and then stop people after specific questions and say, why did you answer that way? In an attempt to identify whether there are any systematic or random errors affecting responses to those. Pretests also will indicate the nature of your sample. Now, those are more expensive pretests. If you're going to do a pretest on 200 people to determine whether you've got a representative sample, that's a pretty big commitment. And it almost becomes the nature of an initial survey rather than a pretest. There are ways to deal with some of the systematic errors, standardizing the data, creating a standardized score, which is the actual score minus the mean divided by the variance on that item. Will deal with acquiescence and extremity. So if people are only using the more positive end of the scale, say on a 7-point scale, if they're only answering 5, 6, and 7, then you can standardize those data and you'll get a mean score for those people that is comparable with the mean score of other people who are using the middle of the scale or only the bottom of the scale, for example. So what you find is that when anybody is 1 scale point above his own mean, that means the same thing whether they're using the top of the scale or the bottom of the scale or the middle of the scale. And the same thing with extremity. If people are using both ends of the scale, what happens is they have more variance in their responses because there's a wider range between their scores than people who are using only the middle of the scale. And so by subtracting the mean from the score and then dividing by the variance, you sort of eliminate both those kinds of problems. Another way to mitigate responses is to assure people that their answers are anonymous. So this helps helps to minimize social desirability and demand effects, because people are assured that their responses aren't being used as ways to judge them as individuals. Simply asking people to be honest helps. It's no guarantee, but it helps. And in some specific questions, if rather than asking what do you do or what do you believe, if you ask them what they think other people believe or other people do, you get a pretty fair estimate of what they're doing, because their best guess as to what other people may be what they themselves do. Using multiple interviewers, coders, and then monitoring those people is principally a way to mitigate against interviewer problems, whether it's bias, particularly fraud. And doing repeat coding is a way to identify problem questions and to reduce random errors in the way data are coded. So repeat coding means that you would have the same survey responses coded twice, and then you would compare to see that you get the same data entry for each one.